Thank you. I'd like to welcome members to the 24th meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in 2020. And our first item today is for the committee to agree to take agenda item 3 in private. This is an item to discuss the evidence we're going to take from the Ethical Standards Commissioner. Do members agree to take this item in private? Thank you very much for that. Okay then. So next item today, agenda item 2, is to take evidence from the Commissioner for Ethical Standards and Public Life in Scotland on her annual reports. And joining us today are Caroline Anderson, Commissioner for Ethical Standards and Public Life in Scotland, and Ian Bruce, Public Appointments Manager. I welcome you both to the meeting. And Commissioner, would you like to make a short opening statement, please? Thank you.
That would be super. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present evidence to the committee today. I'm accompanied by Mr. Bruce, who you'll recall is the Public Appointments Manager. During my first evidence session in late February of this year, I informed the committee of progress in the restructure of the complaints handling function of my office. The restructure was necessary to address historic inefficiencies and a number of key legacy issues regarding councillor complaints and public body complaints, including an aged backlog of investigation cases. The restructure progressed during the months that followed, despite the challenges of the pandemic, and has since been concluded. The restructure has secured a number of benefits for the office. In budgetary terms, savings of approximately 450,000 are projected in the 5 years from 2021, which equates to a saving of circa 48% of my annual office budget. The legacy of investigation cases which I inherited has been addressed and concluded, with ongoing investigations now being few and very recent. The long-standing issue of protracted investigation times and hence the duration of associated stresses for those involved has been overcome as a consequence of the restructure. This has been achieved without any change in the number of full-time equivalent staff in the office. The new staff complement was modelled to deliver the skill set and the capacity needed to service a complaints population of increased complexity and gravitas. Overall then, the restructure has successfully created a modern and efficient complaints handling operation, producing robust, high-quality outputs and discharge of this statutory function. The implementation of the restructure was, of course, punctuated by the pandemic. I invoked the Office Business Continuity Plan on the 16th of March 2020 and successfully relocated the office to a wholly remote operation over the coming days. Throughout lockdown and thereafter, the now remote office provided a continuous and full service and discharge of the statutory functions. This was achieved whilst facilitating reduced capacity at times arising from the pandemic due to changed family responsibilities and similar. I've continued to support the staff throughout, encouraging optimal self-care, supplying home office equipment, promoting good mental and physical health. And in terms of our stakeholders and service users, I contacted local authorities and parties to complaints, offering extended time periods for response in recognition of the unique challenges attached to that. Turning then to MSP complaints, which are up to date and have been responded to in a timely fashion throughout the period. My annual report provides details of the increased volume of MSP complaints and cases received during the 1920 financial year. MSP complaints increased by almost 500% and cases by 77% during that year as compared to 1819. Complaints remain quite high compared to 1819 and given the upcoming election may not abate through to the end of the current reporting year. MSP complaints have and continue to be almost exclusively made by members of the public. Turning then to public appointments. During lockdown, a significant proportion of new appointment activity was put on hold and I granted code variations to allow term extensions and reappointments of current board members beyond the 8-year maximum normally permitted, so ensuring board continuity. The latest set of these requests was responded to in August, allowing term extensions up to August 21. And as a result, officials and boards have the leeway to maintain continuity whilst dealing with the outbreak and ongoing aftermath of the pandemic. The situation regarding ongoing appointment activity is being kept under review by the Office. I also issued a code consultation regarding the revision of the Code of Practice in August 20 and later extended the consultation deadline to facilitate response from the widest spectrum of our stakeholders. I'm grateful for the many responses received, and particularly from those bodies with an interest in equality and diversity. I greatly appreciate the committee's very helpful response and note the members' support for the code of revision in order to address the problems previously commented on in my annual report and updates. I particularly note the committee's reference to the participation of those in remote and rural areas within its response. I would draw the committee's attention to the consultation response received from the Scottish Government, which is an outlier response and a cause for my concern. The Scottish Government are suggesting a move to principles-based regulation and further that the methods and practices used by Scottish ministers in making appointments be completely removed from the code. This proposal is wholly incompatible with the 2003 Act and with the intentions of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government has posited that the current code is stifling innovation, which is most misleading. They appear to favour following the civil service recruitment model, which is wholly inappropriate and in fact opposite to the practice anticipated by Audit Scotland in its report called Role of Boards. The Scottish Government's response has also posited that Scottish ministers might draft their own code of practice, or that the role of appointments regulation might sit with another regulatory body entirely. Overall, this points to a preference for the avoidance of scrutiny on the part of the Scottish Government in this regard. This suggested approach would preclude the Parliament from holding the Scottish Government to account for a lack of progress on diversity or for following the code-driven procedure on appointment activity generally. Essentially, appointment activity would fall below the radar. To me, this is an incongruous response on the part of the Government, given the lack of progress in diversity beyond gender parity, with a stalled or declining position, for example, in terms of disability. My intention is to revise the code, including value-added provision to drive appropriate appointment activity, to ensure that public appointments are open to people from all walks of life. My next step will be to produce a draft of the code reflecting these intentions for further consultation with the Scottish ministers and the committee. I have other ongoing concerns around public appointments which I have noted and acted on to the extent possible within my statutory role. In terms of the achievement of gender parity on boards in 2019, I was interested to explore the associated intersectionality of that metric. An analysis of associated data in terms of household income revealed that the bulk of board applicants and appointees remained unchanged in this regard. So whilst gender representation may have changed, societal representation in terms of income appears to be almost static. Also, the low numbers of applicants for chair roles, particularly for health boards, continues to be a matter of concern, which my office has raised repeatedly with officials, but without a substantive solution in response. Field appointment rounds represent a period of uncertainty for the boards in question, as well as being a waste of public money. To address these and other concerns, at least in part, my recent survey of public body board members raised a series of questions aimed at uncovering the reasons for the aforementioned and other perennial appointments issues. I look forward to reporting on the results of this survey and related conclusions in 2021. Thank you for the opportunity to make these introductory remarks to the committee. I now look forward to answering your questions with the assistance of Mr. Bruce.
Yes, thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you for your statement. I would like now to be able to put some questions to you both from members, and first person up is Neil Finlay. Neil, please.
Thanks and good morning everybody, and thanks for the report. Could I ask a few things first of all in relation to what you inherited, which I think is of concern to us, that you refer to legacy issues such as a vacancy rate of 71%, backlog of complaints, no temporary cover, serious delays. All of that seems to be an organisation that was dysfunctional. Who was overseeing the organisation at that time? Who was monitoring the organisation's performance?
Well, there are various strands associated with the monitoring of all of the office holders. My understanding is that the SPCB has the budgetary control. That really is the greater extent of the oversight. Essentially a functional review perhaps would have discovered these issues, but it is an independent office. So from that point of view, it's the Commissioner that has to make the decisions in regards to the operation of the office. But essentially, the SPCB look after the financial accountability, the budgetary aspects of the organisation, and then the auditor comes along and looks at the finances and ensures that the expenditures that have occurred during the year concerned are in alignment with the necessary or the expected budgetary expenses that had been granted by the SPCB in the first place.
So as long as the money's there, balances, then the corporate body in the Parliament will sign that off. But there's no one independent or no organisation that oversees your organisation. And so, for example, if we went back to a situation, let's just take, for example, where we had 71% vacancy rates, no temporary cover, serious delays and a backlog and a dysfunctional organisation, no one would really know unless somebody blew the whistle on that.
That is the impression that is given by the situation that I inherited. I certainly was not aware that these problems existed in the organisation, despite performing extensive due diligence before I took over. I asked these questions, as it were.
Does that concern you that there's no one and a pair of eyes watching and holding you to account effectively for what you're doing, or your organisation's account? Sorry.
Well, if I could comment that I did observe that in England there are reviews performed of independent offices such as my own on a periodic basis, and they have this function that I think you're seeking, Mr. Findlay, where someone delves into the operations of an organisation and sees if everything's going well, if everything's operating in an efficient and effective manner. And I've actually seen a situation where this is done between such a review is performed between office holders, one demitting and a new one coming on board. And then the review, the review report can recommend certain milestones, certain changes that have to be made, and give a timeline within which those changes are expected. So I think that is a much more transparent situation, if you understand me, where everyone knows what's going to be involved and required of them. The problems in an organisation are then transparent. The situation's accounted for in the public domain, and the incoming individual is well aware of what they have to deliver. So I think it's a more accountable way to operate, and stronger governance. I can only speak for what I've inherited. But yes, the situation at that stage was that the auditor comes along and audits the finances. No one looks under the bonnet, as it were. I have taken steps to bring internal audit function in, which would be the other way, that the concerns that Mr. Finlay has voiced, the other way that they could be brought to account to some extent. So there was no internal audit function. This has been punctuated by the pandemic, of course, but I'd taken steps fairly early on to look to bring an internal audit in to assist me. It's always good to have a fresh pair of eyes, even if you think things are going very well. I'm very open to any way to improve the operation, and therefore, you know, we've been involved in looking to bring internal audit in.
Do you want to bring John in first?
I'd like John in first. Okay, no problem at all. Yeah. No, thanks for that, Neil. John Scott, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for your opening statement. It's the age-old question: who guards the guardians? And it appears, I mean, there's been no one guarding the guardians. Historically, I believe there used to be someone who guarded the guardians, so to speak, in terms of reviewing the work of commissioners. But has that fallen by the wayside within? Or does the buck now just stop entirely with the corporate body? But it does appear somebody's been asleep at the wheel here, and there hasn't obviously been any performance-related assessment at all, or at least if there was, people couldn't necessarily have been satisfied with it. So I agree entirely with Neil Findlay's line of questioning. I think you've probably given the answers, but I'm horrified by this.
Well, I've only been in post since April 19, so I can only report to the committee what I found, you know, and certainly I wouldn't have been happy to continue. I felt that these problems were very severe and that I needed to move on them. And as a result of the transformational work that I've put in place now via the two restructuring phases to date, you know, we are up to date, and obviously we're a volume-driven organisation, and you know, we could come into the office in the morning and have 100 complaints, and we wouldn't be able to, you know, move through them by the end of the week, if you understand me. So, as a volume-driven organisation, you always are going to have those fluctuations, which means you will have very busy times, and however, that isn't the totality of what I inherited, unfortunately, which was very much a backlog situation, and an office that had been, you know, wasn't performing in the way that one would hope.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just before we go back, Neil, Jamie had something on the same line, please.
Yeah, well, it's two things very quickly. Firstly, just to clarify, sorry, good morning, Commissioner, and to the panel.
Good morning.
Just to clarify that you think a similar, say, independent review as they have in England could be of benefit to ensuring there is this proper oversight. Absolutely.
You know, no one's looking under the bonnet, if you want to say it like that. At present, we're just looking at the finances, and as the members will know from their extensive experience, the finances it's really a problem on fraud, etc. It's the way the money's been spent, and it's looking at the actual operation of an office and assuring that it's being run in an efficient, effective manner, which delivers the statutory function as quickly, effectively, and cost effectively as possible. You know, and indeed, the thing about the functional review or the tailored review, whatever you want to call it, it's a way to look at how things have changed over time. So we, not just my office, but the various office holders, the demands upon them and the nature of the work will have altered over time. I mentioned in my previous evidence session, that the complexity and gravitas of the complaints, the type of subject matter seems to be much more complex and potentially contentious than it has been in the past. So the reviews that you've alluded to are a way of looking at the function that an office holder is performing and what that means in today's world. Remembering that my office certainly has its roots in around the year 2000, almost a pre-digital world, so obviously what it is now compared to at its nascence is very, very different. So yes, I feel that it is essential for these reviews to be carried out on a periodic basis by individuals with operational expertise who know what good looks like in terms of operations, and therefore that gives the opportunity to modernise it and to make sure that the budget, the public purse, is being applied in the most cost-effective and efficient way.
Thank you very much for that and for the kind of candid approach that you've taken on that. And I mean, that term, no one looks under the bonnet, is extremely concerning, I think, probably for all members of this committee. Can I ask just then, kind of almost looking historically, you've talked about the legacy issues and the backlog of cases and the stress that caused and some of the members of staff, and that it wasn't performing as well as it should do. Do you have any concern that cases, perhaps before your time, historic cases, may not have been investigated and concluded as they should have been?
I've had no evidence come to me that suggested that was the case. So I have focused on the backlog that I inherited, and it was all in very draft stage. And my staff reviewed and worked through as necessary to bring it to conclusion. So my focus has very much been on the conclusion of that work, and I have had nothing come to my attention from any previous parties to complaints that give me cause for concern that anything major had gone astray, prior to my term.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Right, thank you, Jamie. And back to Neil, please.
Just one more question about the legacy stuff, then I'll move on to some of the work that you've done. Was your predecessor, did they resign or retire?
Pardon me, sorry, I didn't quite catch you, Mr. Plummer.
Did your predecessor resign or retire?
Oh, he was in place for his full term, yes. He didn't resign, he just retired.
And did he receive a financial
He was in place for...
Did he receive a financial
Pardon me, sorry?
Did he receive a financial payoff?
Oh, no. My predecessor stayed for the full term, for his full, 5 years, okay. The full term. He didn't leave. Okay, thanks.
In the report, you say that you have doubled the hours for investigation work. So this is part of your, your reorganisation. You've not required any more full-time staff to do that. There's cases are being processed quicker, and over the piece you'll save £450,000. 2 questions. Right. How did you do that? And secondly, are you any good at building ferries?
Well, how did I do it? My focus is on outcome and service delivery. That's my interest, my personality, my focus. My interest was in, high quality, the highest quality of work. So I could see with the part-time, 0 hours contract, people who were only working a day a week or so, that really there wasn't the progress on work, with that very, very limited input. So I saw that I needed my investigation officers be full-time, really, to be able to move through the work in a quick and thorough fashion, and also to share learnings, etc. So I saw that that was essential. So I reviewed the staff complement and I revised it. Really, I saw that with the heightened complexity of work and the heightened volume of work, I needed to bring those individuals on a full-time basis instead. So in doing that, the former 0 hours contractors departed from the organisation, and they had preserved rights from previous public sector organisations. So the new staff then started at the grades, the correct salary grade, as per a revision of those grades which had occurred prior to my term. So that was true then for, as I worked through the restructure, essentially the entire investigations team was replaced, and the new team were all on the revised grades as per approved by the SPCB prior to my time, and that has allowed me to make that cost saving going forward.
Final point, could you provide us with, could you provide the committee with the, not identifying individuals obviously, but the numbers of people who were in the organisation who were working at specific salary ranges prior to you coming in and now that you have come in, so we can have a look at that?
I couldn't indeed, Mr. Finlay, but honestly I couldn't remember those figures off the top of my head.
No.
Can I provide that to the...
Provide that in writing later. I don't ask you.
Absolutely. We'll do a full analysis.
Thank you.
As you've asked for there. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Commissioner. Just to emphasise and following on from that the role of this committee is, or one of its roles, is to take evidence from the Commissioner on a regular basis, and that provides a form of scrutiny such as we've just been talking about there. So that's worth mentioning, I think. Patrick Harvey, please, would you like to come up? Patrick, can you hear us?
Sorry, Convener, I hadn't requested a question at this point.
Oh, you hadn't? I do apologise. Sorry, I just had a note of something there, but I was okay. Okay, well, thanks. We'll come back to you anyway, Patrick. So thank you for that. John Scott, please.
Good morning, Commissioner. Can I ask you what has been the impact so far on your workload following January's Code of Conduct revision, which brought complaints about MSPs' conduct towards their staff and the staff of other MSPs under your investigative remit?
Yes, thank you for that. That's right. The Code of Conduct revision occurred in January of this current year, and it brought respect and courtesy. It's extended respect and courtesy provision to bullying, harassment and inappropriate behaviour, including sexual misconduct. Now, it appears to me that the Code of Conduct revision perhaps wasn't picked up by the media or interest groups, because at this point it hasn't had an impact on my workload really at all. I do note that the Code of Conduct revision occurred just in the weeks prior to the outbreak of the global pandemic, which likely decreased the optics around it as well. In putting together my response to the committee's kind invite to contribute to the financial memorandum, I did do a wee bit of research, and one of the questions I asked was about the independent support service that had been put in place for the SPCB and other parliamentary staff to raise complaints about these sort of behaviours. And I have to admit, I was surprised to hear that there had been no calls at all to that support line, which was set up in early 2019 and which hadn't received any calls by August 2020. So that hadn't been utilised. it just made me wonder. You know, I read that in other jurisdictions there's a bit of a culture of silence, a culture of back covering in relation to these sorts of behaviours, and it made me ask myself, I wondered, was that an issue closer to home as well? However, the committee obviously shaped the Code of Conduct revision and the legislative change on the basis of a huge amount of research, much of which occurred before my time. And no doubt the committee will have a view on the likely impact on my workload now that will occur in the coming months and years. I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Orr and her team for her kind assistance in helping us with our contribution to that financial memorandum.
Okay, thank you. According to your report at figures 14 and 16, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of cases processed by your office in 2019-20 compared with previous years. Would you like to account for those figures, and how confident are you that you're comparing like for like? I mean, there's twice the number of cases effectively, although there's 109 complaints. If you'd like to answer that, please.
Thank you. I'll just turn up my compendium of figures here, just so I have that in front of me. Yes, well, in around the figures that you're talking about, 14 and 16 and figure 13, I just point out that all or nearly all of the MSP complaints are made by the public. So I would say that reflects a high level of scrutiny by the public in this jurisdiction and represents a soundly functioning democracy potentially. The activities of the Parliament, they're a big stimulus for the complaints that they receive. For example, in the year that you're asking about, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill was a contentious matter and give rise to a number of complaints. Also, general MSP commentary on social media, that also gives rise to complaints. And in the year concerned, I recall that there were over 60 complaints in relation to a single MSP post. So, you know, that really increases the figures. I also noticed that in other jurisdictions, there is a high volume of MSP complaints, or sorry, MP complaints, as it were. At the weekend, in preparation for this session, I searched on media for anything relevant, and there was coverage of the Welsh Commissioner, and I saw that the volume increase experienced in Wales in the last reporting year was the greatest ever, the highest year on record. So, you know, in terms of the numbers reported, I received 109 complaints, but if you take the 63 complaints on the single MSP post out, that brings us down to in line with 40 odd complaints, as opposed to 20 odd complaints in the prior year, if you take that one large case out of it. So I don't really think that's a huge jump. At those sort of levels, the population is so small that you can't really say there's a particular trend. I would assure the committee that the complaints are being processed and recorded in a consistent and comparable manner with previous years.
Well, I hear what you say, but the cases have actually gone up from 22 to 39, notwithstanding. The caseload has gone up from 22 to 39, which is close to double. And I just wonder if there's any particular reason for that. And also note that a lot of complaints are being referred to the presiding officer, and not through many other channels. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. The figure for the presiding officer referrals, as we put it, basically what happens here is that I often will receive complaints that they are actual code of conduct breaches, but they're simply not for me. So they're described as out with jurisdiction. So in this case, where it is not for my consideration because it is, for example, for the presiding officer or the SPCB, for example, then we will advise the complainer that this is the case and give them the contact details should they wish to send their complaint through to the presiding officer. Now, in regards to the numbers that you're talking about, the 67 complaints that went to the presiding officer, 63 related to that one case, the MSP post. So if you take that out, then only 4 of the other complaints ended up going to the presiding officer, as it were. So, you know, that really means it was quite a small amount outside that one very odd complaint odd case that had 63 referrals to the presiding officer attached to it, that single post.
Right. I think you've probably answered the final question I had of, which is that 42 complaints against MSPs were found by you to be inadmissible. Those would be the ones that should properly have gone to the presiding officer, I take it from what you've just said.
Well, no, inadmissibility, the level of inadmissibility is very high in all jurisdictions. That basically would imply that it's not a code breach for some reason. So, for example, I mentioned the Welsh Commissioner. In Wales, there are 60 MSSs, but yet they had 84 inadmissible complaints. So double this number, double our number. I also recall the English Minister, English Commissioner shares her annual report with me, and I recall reading the first report that she sent through, where she commented that she'd received thousands, I think it was 2,500 complaints regarding Brexit, all of which were inadmissible. So, you know, inadmissible complaints, that's just a fact of life. So I don't think 40 is an awful lot, really, to be honest. And there's an inherent value in having a portal where your public can complain and hold elected representatives to account and exchange.
So you're generally
enter into dialogue.
So you're generally happy
Pardon
with
me, sorry?
You're generally happy with the system,
Yes,
as it were.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I don't think there's any getting away from inadmissibility, you know.
Absolutely. Understood. Right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just Gil Patterson has a supplementary on this issue as well. Gil?
Yes, good morning, panel, and good morning, Commissioner, and Ian. Nice to see you both. You mentioned the fact that social media attracted on one single member quite a considerable amount of complaints. And do you think that if we normalised, and made it automatic, we should look at complaints on the social media, and what would the parameters be if we were going to, whereas at the present time, effectively at the present time, complaints to the social media are not part of the code of conduct. But if we normalise it and make it part of the code of conduct, what would you think that would what load would that bring to you?
Well, social media posts are oh, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Social media posts are a huge source of complaints across the board. Public bodies, public body board members, councillors, MSPs. So, social media is a huge source. In various ways, the language used, the views stated on social media, etc. So that's simply the platform from whence the complaints are derived. You know, and I suppose 20 years ago it would have been statements given to newspapers and printed, you know, so that's just moved on to being social media as our source. So, you know, where it's political dialogue and a political opinion, you know, that is a source. And of course, the MSPs are allowed to state, they have the freedom of expression and are allowed to state those opinions. So it is a source, but often it won't be a breach of the code because MSPs are within their rights to express how they feel on various political topics. Sorry, is that answering your question?
Yes, but it does in some way. But if we were to change our practice by informing the public that utterances on the social media now come under the code, do you think that would attract malevolent complaints based on political opinion, which is different from being how you act as an MSP compared to your opinion on a given matter?
Mr. Bruce has been assisting me with MSP complaints, so I wonder, could Mr. Bruce contribute to this?
Yes, certainly.
Please.
Thank you. Ian?
Yes, so I've taken on what one might call triage of complaints for MSPs for some time now, so an initial assessment. Sorry, good morning, convener and members, and excuse me for not saying hello. It's an unusual situation for us all, I'm sure. But thanks again for the opportunity to give evidence. But so from my initial assessment of complaints, I think I can confirm what the Commissioner is saying. Far and away, the majority of those related to social media are about MSPs expressing views on political issues, and then that generates a significant amount of public interest, shall we say, on social media platforms like Twitter in particular. So I think the code does in fact cover the sorts of things that the MSPs might say. So that would be, you know, there are clearly respect provisions in the code. But generally speaking, the things that people react to are political opinions, as opposed to reacting to those provisions that relate to a lack of respect. So I'm not sure that a code revision necessary or would be appropriate, because the behaviours that are of concern and that are set out in the code are still covered, regardless of whether or not an MSP makes a statement, shall we say, in a public forum or via use of social media. I'm not sure that saying anything specific about that particular platform would be necessary or would change the outcome.
Okay, thanks for that. Very clear. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much for that. And Patrick Harvey, you have a supplementary here. Patrick?
Thank you, convener. The witnesses will know that complaints about parliamentarians have been in the news recently. We've seen Ken McGuinness subject to a very serious sanction in the House of Lords, grounds of his homophobic and bullying behaviour. And I wonder whether you could reflect on this issue about the balance between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour versus free speech. Caroline Anderson mentioned the GRA, for example, and I think we're all able to reflect that that debate is one that gives rise to accusations of transphobia versus accusations of misogyny. But there will be acceptable and unacceptable ways within the code to express political views. Where do you feel that the balance lies in relation to this issue of free speech versus hate speech in relation to the code of conduct issues and your own work. The example of Ken McGuinness, I hope, is one where the issue is pretty clear and that most people would reject the way that he behaved. But there is ambiguity here. Do we need to more clearly define that balance, or do we need to more clearly understand what it currently is?
I receive is considered on its own particular facts and circumstances, and where it is in this domain of political opinion, etc., expression of strong views, then of course I refer to Article 10 and the views of the court in regards to Article 10, and that really there is little leeway to interfere with political expression. However, it's a different matter if it goes into gratuitous personal offence. That's where it crosses that line. And so it's really looking at the balance of that. It hasn't been marginal in any cases that we've had in terms of MSP complaints. It hasn't been marginal. It's been the expression of a political view rather than anything personal that would not be covered that I can recollect in my term to date. So really, that's the reference point that we have. Every complaint is considered against the code, the guidance, the legislation which created the office, and then Article 10 as well, if needs be. So that really is the legislation that we look to see if the statement that has been made by the MSP concerned is covered or not. And if it were a marginal situation, or if there's any doubt, we would of course investigate further and I would provide my findings to the committee. That really is the situation. I look at the complaints as they come in. So the Act actually prevents me from giving my opinion on any hypothetical, as it were. So I simply look at the complaints, their context, their nuance, the particular facts and circumstances, and apply all the relevant reference sources to the information that's complained about, and decide how to proceed properly from there.
Thank you. So just in short, you wouldn't see any risk that a case like that of Ken McGuinness, where the same language, which I won't repeat here, but if an MSP, for example, used that same language but without the bullying behaviour, you wouldn't see any risk that someone in that circumstance could rely on a free speech defence?
Well, again, I don't have the details of that particular case in front of me, but where there's an element of gratuitous personal offence, then that isn't covered under the Article 10. So the Act actually prevents me from making a statement regarding where a hypothetical would occur. Mr. Harvey, I'm actually not allowed to do that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right, well, thank you both for that. Okay, and Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Bruce and Ms. Anderson. Just following on from that, I understand, I think there are at least one complaint, MSP complaint in the system. Are you confident that we will, as a committee, be able to deal with that before the end of term, before dissolution?
I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable talking about any specific complaint in a public forum. I'll write to the committee outside this forum in relation to a specific complaint.
Yeah, I'm not asking
Thank you.
to
Apology.
yeah, it's just, you know, obviously we would like to get our work completed before the end of term. I just wondered if you felt that you were able to have that work done before the end of term, but that's okay, I can move on. In your opening statement, you said that the Scottish Government want to remove from the code and various other things which sounded quite disturbing. Can I ask what discussions you think, well, why you think the Scottish Government want to do this, and what discussions you've had with them in relation to that?
Thank you. Could I refer Mr. Bruce, that question to Mr. Bruce, as he's been dealing with the detail in regards to the consultation? Good, thank you.
Thank you. Ian Bruce, please.
Yes, happily. The Scottish Government's response to our consultation is in the public domain, as is the committees and everyone else who we're very grateful to for providing a response. It's available to view on our website. So the 2003 Act intimated that the Code of Practice should include the methods and practices employed by the Scottish ministers in the making of public appointments. The Scottish Government's response basically suggested that all of the methods and practices that currently sit in the Code should be stripped out, because they have described those as operational matters for the Scottish Government. So we do feel that that's incompatible with the legislation. I did have an early discussion with an official from the Scottish Government about what they may be considering setting out in their consultation response. We didn't have time. That's a great deal of time. That's often the case. Generally, my meetings with them are restricted, not at our end, to an hour or so. And I asked, because she did say she had a number of questions about what we'd set out in our code consultation. And I asked, given that we don't have the time, could you possibly put all of those in writing to us so that we are in a position to give you a substantive response to those. Those questions were never forthcoming. And obviously, the next thing we saw was the consultation response, which was sent to us. I think it was on the date of the deadline. So that's the situation.
Okay, thank you. In your annual report and accounts, you find that the performance by Scottish ministers to achieve diversity on public boards is quite patchy. Why do you think clear and convincing plans, as you call it, are lacking for achieving parity in some areas?
The issues that are concerned here, they have their roots in events which occurred prior to my term in office, quite near the start of the previous Commissioner's term. So again, I'll ask Mr. Bruce to answer that question, please.
Ian Bruce.
Yes, happily. Been interesting, let's put it like that. Some years ago, I think there was a significant level of governance around public appointments. I think that followed on from the First Minister's very public statement that she wanted to see 50-50 by 2020, so gender parity on boards, and that was great. And it really was. It was of significant benefit, I think, to us and more generally. Because when you get that ministerial commitment, you find that the resources become marshalled behind it. The Scottish Government established its corporate diversity, public boards and corporate diversity programme board. So it was there to provide strategic oversight of appointment activity. And then there was a smaller board set up below that, which we also belong to, and its role was to really assess progress in relation to gender parity in particular, which was the outcome that everyone was focused on. So you had basically activity, which was being closely monitored. There's flexibility, lots of flexibility in the current code, and it was being capitalised on, so new approaches were being taken. That was great. The results of those were being reported up to this strategic board that provided oversight. And it was a bit of a virtuous circle, and you know, we did see success in that area, which was fantastic. At the same time, we were in dialogue with the Scottish Government and obviously saying, well, look, this is great, but we aren't achieving that same success in other areas, and we really need to make provisions to do that. So at the time, I'm talking about over 3 years ago, we did agree with the government, and the government was happy to agree to bespoke plans for both disability and younger people. And you'll be aware from the report that, you know, those are areas in which we haven't seen the progress that we might have. And about 3 years later, the government said, well, actually, no, we're reneging on that promise. Sorry to put it that way, but that is the reality. We believe that bespoke plans for disability for younger people, these aren't necessary. We're going to produce a central plan. We think that's going to be sufficient. And they've done so, and we've seen iterations of that. But I think from my perspective, the actions set out in that plan are quite vague. They aren't smart. So it's difficult to see how they're going to deliver. It's very difficult to hold the government to account for plans of that nature, because, you know, they aren't very specific, they aren't measurable, and that's problematic. And then over and above that, because the programme board itself was disbanded, and then the board that sat below that was disbanded, it's very hard to see where the clear strategic leadership for the improvements in these other areas is going to come from. So that's the position that we're in.
Thanks for that. Were they disbanded pre-COVID or perhaps during COVID because of, you know, huge amount of commitments for Scottish ministers and the civil service? But I notice also that you are intending to have more frequent and public reporting on Scottish government appointment activity. So what do you think might be achieved by doing that?
Sorry, just to answer the first part of the question. Oh, sorry, Ian, are you finishing your response there? Or?
Sorry, I'm fine. So it was some time, the programme board was disbanded some time ago. And the board that sat below it was 2 years later. I think it's appropriate to add at this point. So, and I genuinely don't wish to be overcritical of the activities of officials. They are stretched in so many different directions. Clearly, I think we have a shared outcome that we're looking for alongside the ministers, which is effective boards reflective of society. I think we are obliged as a regulator to observe when we think that that particular target isn't going to be met. But we really do empathise with officials. So many things have arisen and gotten in the way. Brexit first, and then a pandemic. And so we do realise that the resources that are available to them are exceptionally stretched. But I'll hand over to the Commissioner.
Just before you come back in, sorry, Commissioner, just before you come back in order that we can keep this line going a wee bit, we've got two short sups from Gil Patterson and John Scott, and that will help to build us towards the end of this section. So, Gil Patterson first then, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, it's on that point. I notice in the table 6 on page 8 that actually shows a slight improvement in the situation where people in low earnings are coming up and those in higher earnings are appointments are going down, if I'm reading this right. So I wonder, looking at other places, and I take your point that if there was people set up specifically to drive this up and they're not there, I understand that point. That's something we should be looking at. Is there something that we can pick up from elsewhere that other jurisdictions are doing to make this improvement, particularly on getting folk, not necessarily young people, just right across the board, people from poorer backgrounds that are missing from our public service.
Answer, Mr. Patterson, on my behalf, please.
So, an interesting question, and I'm not sure we necessarily need to look elsewhere, because the reality is the Scottish Government has done exceptionally well. Specific appointment rounds, and we wouldn't be able to produce the good practice case studies on what they're doing. That were not the case. So let's use disability as an example, and clearly there's an intersection between disability and low income as well. But we have good practice case studies about the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland on our website, and because it's obliged to have members with a disability, then officials and indeed our office go the extra mile. They revise practices, the attraction to fill those roles is done quite differently. So running open days specifically for disabled people, positive action measures, making the plaque more accessible, making it easier for people to apply, and you get a successful outcome, and you see disabled people appointed. Similarly on income, one of our more recent case studies was for the Poverty and Equality Commission, and again, just using very different practices, excellent outreach. I think the last time I met the committee, I also spoke about the real importance of how merit is defined. That's one of the things that's come across very clearly to us from the equalities organisations who've responded to the consultation, is that how you define merit makes a big difference to the types of people that you are going to see appointed. So what I'm saying is the good practice is there, and the Scottish Government is actually they're responsible for that good practice. What we aren't seeing is it necessarily codified and rolled out so that it becomes the norm on all appointment rounds. And there are myriad reasons for that, one of which we've touched on, which is, you do need to resource that differently. But in comparison with other parts of the UK, I think generally speaking we're doing well. We just understand, I think collectively we need to do better. Interesting, Lord Holmes was commissioned by the UK government to conduct a review into the lack of disabled people on the boards in England, Wales, and he conducted that review and made some recommendations, and to be honest with you, they weren't entirely new. So we do all, I think, collectively know the sorts of measures that you need to put in place to see more disabled people appointed, and he made his recommendations 2 years ago. He reported just very recently, we received his report 2 years on, and I think only 2 of those recommendations, and they were relatively straightforward ones, had actually been implemented in that time. So implementation matters. It's not necessarily whether or not, we haven't done the research, we don't know what needs to be done. I think we do. It's actually doing it that makes the difference.
Okay, thank you. And just quite quickly then, please, John, if that's all right.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Just take you back to the generality of the public appointments, and this is a question for Mr. Bruce. But notwithstanding, the Commissioner said in her annual report and accounts that diversity enablement activities by Scottish ministers have continued to be diffuse, with the Scottish Government reaffirming its commitment to some activities but with no clear and convincing plans for achieving parity in other areas. And without sustained effort in areas other than gender, we will either maintain the status quo or go backwards in respect of other protected characteristics. So would you like to expand on those remarks by the Commissioner and what you think will happen if the Scottish Government essentially don't pay more attention?
I suppose to me it seems self-evident, but and you'll excuse me, but I did refer to the lack of concrete plans in relation to certain protected characteristics. I'm not sure I buy the argument that these bespoke plans aren't required. To use a simple example, so The Scottish Government did already publish a commitment to having a bespoke plan for people from a BME background. So, and we were provided with the latest iteration of that relatively recently. And it does have some very clear actions agreed with groups that are representative of BME communities in Scotland. So that's great, you have a bespoke plan, but over and above that, you actually need to implement the actions in it. And so when I'm talking about things being diffuse, so they are diffuse because you've got a central plan that's very general in nature, which doesn't include, we think, the smart actions that it requires to in order to elicit the changes that we need to see. And then over and above that, implementation absolutely is required. We've run thematic reviews, and one of the things that, and I'm sorry to be beating this drum again, but you need to learn from experience. And when things go very well, you need to codify that and roll it out. It's no good doing the right thing once. You need to ensure that it's happening across the piece, and that's when you see changes being made and the difference that you need to see. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I would have liked specific examples of where things could be done better and immediately, but I appreciate we're short of time.
Yeah, we are a wee bit short of time, but I was wondering then on that basis if that's something that possibly Mr Bruce or the Commissioner could maybe send us some information on, if that's possible. If that's okay, thank you.
Surely.
That'd be great, and thank you very much. The only reason that we're having to curtail things a wee bit is that we've got to be pretty much finished by 11 o'clock at the latest. So on that basis then, if people could just give us a focused question and answer a no, but we don't want to curtail elements which really require good coverage. So on that basis, Patrick Harvey, next please, thank you.
Thanks, Convener. Some of the issues that I was going to raise have been covered already, so I'll try and compress them a little bit to save time. The discussion about, we know what we need to do to improve recruitment to boards for other protected characteristics is very familiar. I seem to remember us having the same discussion last year. We know what we need to do and we just need to do it. So it's not really about trying to understand the barriers. Are there particular organisations that have been more effective, whether that's at a wider range of protected characteristics, whether it's around getting women to take up chair positions, which is still quite low, whether it's around attracting younger people, for example? Other organisations that are getting it right, that good practice isn't being shared?
I have to defer to Mr Bruce, who's involved in that diversity research and therefore could answer and would have the knowledge about other organisations that might be able to assist.
Thank you. Ian Bruce?
I'm sorry to repeat myself here. I think the government gets it right, but not all the time. And the type of recruitment that we're talking about here, it's quite rarefied. So we're talking about the recruitment of non-executive directors and chairs to boards. So, and that's not, it's not entirely comparable to other types of recruitment. Although good practice certainly is shareable across different types of recruitment exercise. So we refreshed our guidance this year on good practice in recruitment and selection. We always use the latest research on what good looks like. So currently we've referred our public appointments advisors who in turn advise panels to the work of a new organisation, relatively new organisation called Applied, which uses behavioural science to determine the best techniques in order to secure diversity, good diversity outcomes at the conclusion of a given recruitment process. We also refer to the CIPD for similar research and what good looks like. and the government. So again, we wouldn't be providing these case studies, publishing these case studies, if the government wasn't successfully employing these practices on given appointment rounds. But the issue is that it's patchy, and the reason that it's not done all the time, I think more than anything, is time and resource. So you do need to take the time to plan, and you do need to design a barrier-free process, and that is successfully done sometimes, but other times the time isn't available, the resources aren't available, and so you maintain the status quo in terms of diversity. But we absolutely know what good practice is and what it delivers.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Patrick. Again.
Last point from me really is to ask Ian Bruce if he could comment on the role that could be played by public appointment advisors, and also the role that could be played by working more effectively with voluntary organisations, which I think was flagged up by one of the focus groups that the committee recently heard, that voluntary organisations could be used more effectively to source people with relevant experience.
Happily. So I'll maybe talk about the advisors first, but we recruit them, and we've just gone out for another 3, but we recruit them. They're not policemen in the corner. They are there to advise panels, not just on how to comply with the codes, not the bare minimum, but how to go the extra mile. So they are there to give advice on good practice in recruitment and selection, and that's their background, but also with a particular focus on equality and diversity. So our 3 new folks, one of them was on the EHRC previously, currently a consultant in her own right. Another actually used to provide training and advice to the Scottish Parliament on equality and diversity as a consultant. We've got people who are providing advice to the CIPD, another who provides advice to, FTSE 100 companies on equality and diversity issues. So that's the calibre of people that we look to get involved in the public appointments process, and absolutely when their advice is taken on board, we absolutely see that making a difference. So the Commissioner's all about adding value, as she said, and that's one of the places where we see that we can. In terms of voluntary organisations, I actually think the third sector does relatively well. Don't know if it's appropriate, but a consultation document. I think we made reference to both public and private and voluntary sector. So yes, we go off. I'm just accessing the figures. For the voluntary sector, 2019. So the Scottish population voluntary sector is just over 4%. 13.2% of applications that year, and 14.1% of appointments went to people in the voluntary sector. So I don't think there's a particular issue there. And it's also worth saying that yes, absolutely, we've done some work with the voluntary sector. So I think 2 years ago now, we ran alongside the government training for independent panel members. And all of those were drawn from senior figures in the voluntary sector. So not only do they do well in the process, but they're actually represented on selection panels as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, thank you very much for that then. Thank you. And John, do you had a wee thing?
I think Patrick's covered it.
He's covered it all. Okay, well, thank you for that. Thank you for that reply, Mr. Bruce, also. And we'll go to Gil Patterson, please.
I've covered my points, Bill, so far.
You have, right? Okay. Okay.
Yes,
well,
yeah.
yeah, of course, son. You go, John.
I would be interested to know why Ian Bruce, when he last came to the committee, that there was people from the private sector are not applying in the numbers that they could, and when they do apply, they fare more poorly than their public sector counterparts. And what do you feel it's important to increase. What do you feel, or why do you feel it's important to increase the proportion of people with private sector backgrounds serving on public boards? I certainly agree with that sentiment, but I'd like you to explain it as well.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon, Ian.
All I said
yes,
was I think that would be one for the Commissioner. Yeah.
Thank you. Indeed, well, the overall aim here is to produce public boards which are reflective of society. And in the consultation document, that indeed in the figures that Mr. Bruce was just referring to on his screen, you'll see that the Scottish population, 80% has a private sector background, but yet we're only seeing 30% in our public appointment rounds, less than 30% actually in 2019. So we're very much not representing society in terms of these folk with private sector background. We seem to have a huge predominance of public sector background people on the boards, because they have 20% in terms of their the population, yet 45% of the appointees to public body boards come from that public sector background. So they're very dominant. And I feel that there are a number of potential ramifications as a result of this, because I feel that in the absence of these private sector outsiders, there's a greater propensity for groupthink, and minimal challenge potentially will predominate, because you can end up with a club-like environment essentially on these public body boards. And I also think that the opportunities being missed for fresh input from individuals with another work experience. So for example, in terms of risk management, entrepreneurship, novel problem solving, you know, I think a private sector background brings just a fresh attitude, a fresh pair of eyes to these sort of issues. We have been working on an applicant survey, applicants who have come through on various rounds that have been run, and I was provided with a draft version of that report by Mr. Bruce recently, and I noticed that individuals from private sector background were saying they felt that public body board rounds were a closed shop, that you would only have success if you were in the know, if you had an inside track to get the buzzwords. You know, those were the sort of feelings that were being communicated by those who answered the survey and who were from a from a private sector background. Ian, would you like to add anything to that?
I think you've covered it, Commissioner. I mean, certainly we'll happily provide the committee with a full report as and when that's published, and it can reach its own views. So just to say, you know, this has been a particular focus for new Commissioner, and then so we are now, you know, disaggregating some of the information that we get in relation to things like income and sector worked in. Sort of shine a light in this area, so you know that's relatively new for us.
Right, be very grateful if you could supply any information in that regard. And finally, can you tell us what can be done to encourage individuals from households from lower income groups to apply as well, please? And perhaps you can tell us more about the case study and the appointment round for the Poverty and Inequality Commission. Briefly.
Thank you for that question. I'll just give a few brief comments, and then Mr. Bruce can come in with some further detail. But yes, you're quite right. I was interested when I saw the achievement of gender parity on boards to look further and asked for data to show what household income was in terms of this move, you know, this achievement of gender parity. And I was very interested to see that there'd been very little change, that household incomes that we were seeing were more or less static, and that the gender parity was within that higher earning group. And I then noticed when we started to get our responses to the consultation that equality and diversity advocacy groups were pointing out that they felt that lived experience of persons in lower income groups was not really being valued properly in the public body board appointment process. So that being the case, Mr. Bruce referred earlier to the key factors that are barriers there would be the definition of merit, so that it's lived experience that is being considered to be of equal merit to qualifications, corporate skills, whatever. Also, there are issues of the time commitment and remuneration for persons in lower income groups. Obviously, the remuneration is potentially even more important. And finally, the support that we're able to give to these individuals, both in terms of readiness for application and, if appointed, to assist them to make sure their voice is heard. So that would be my introductory comments on that question. Ian, if you could expand, please, on the case studies.
Happily. So I think you made reference to the Poverty and Inequality Commission case study that we published, and that is really such an example of good practice. So it's probably best for me to refer to that because it's a concrete example of what can and I suppose should be done. But there, the early engagement, absolutely tremendous. So our public appointments advisor we allocated had a real commitment to this issue anyway. Chair of the panel equally was very, very committed to this this issue. Given the subject matter that the committee is engaged in, that's very important. And the chair of the body himself also very, very committed. So there was that early engagement with our office and between those parties, but also with the Social Security Committee. It's one of those unusual bodies where appointments are all subject to parliamentary approval as well. So you had that early engagement and yeah, absolutely had that commitment on the part of the parties involved. So time was taken, there was early engagement, there was good planning, and they realised, look, you know, these are the sorts of people that we need in order for this particular board to be successful. And clearly there's scope for the practices used there to be used on other appointment rounds. The Commissioner mentioned definition of merit. If you'll give me a moment, I'll maybe give you an example of how that was done for that particular board.
We're terribly pushed for time. Maybe you could send it to us.
Sorry.
No, not
yes,
at all.
of course.
So Ian,
well, sorry, I'm just trying to help you.
As John's pointed out there, actually, if that's, once again, because you've been very helpful this morning with saying that you will forward this information, if that's something else that would be helpful for us to see.
Very happily do that.
That's very kind, thank you, John. And just to round off, please, and quite quickly, thank you, Neil Finlay.
Thanks. I see there is reference to household income of applicants and appointments. If we refer to that, the median income in Scotland is around about £24,000-25,000 a year, and yet we've got a very low number. I think 12% of applications, 6% of appointments are from people from that income range. You know, it's good and it's very appropriate that, for example, in the Poverty Commission, that they are going through a process and engaging people and recruiting people who have that lived experience. But I think we'll see progress when we have people from that background, income level, and from that class background, in things like economic bodies and arts and culture bodies and education bodies. I don't see them at all. And I don't think, personally, I see no real effort to make that happen. And, you know, the class division is the biggest division in society. Therefore, I think you should be reporting on that up front as the first and most obvious way in which we are failing to be representing, you know, the society and reflective of the society that, frankly, should be the objective of these public appointments.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you for that. Oh, sorry. Thank you for that. Basically, my powers are given to me under the Act, and the power I have to report to Parliament is limited to material non-compliance with the code. So whilst many events may occur which are concerning and of gravitas, they rarely have in my term surpassed that level of material non-compliance that would allow me to report to Parliament as defined by the Act. And because of that, Mr. Finlay, I decided to report more regularly to yourselves, to this committee, being the subject matter committee, acting on behalf of the Parliament to hold the Scottish ministers to account for correct and proper progress on the public appointments arena. And indeed, these points that the committee has kindly raised both today and in its response to me in regards to the consultation, I will be taking that into account when we're looking at how we can revise the code from my powers, from what I can do to ensure that the maximum value is added in efforts to achieve these diversity aims that Mr. Finlay has quite rightly referred to here this morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Now look, thanks to everybody, and particularly our guests, for drawing us in around about the time that we're supposed to anyway, so that's really good. I'd like to thank the Commissioner and Ian Bruce for kindly joining us again today and being so helpful, and including being willing to forward any further information that we didn't have time to actually cover this morning. That's very good of you. So thank you both very much, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. So we're going to move now into a short suspension to enable broadcasting to set up an audio link for us, and once that's established, Sam will start the Teams meeting. So thank you. We're moving into private. Thank you very much.